Hello, I'm Dylan Davis and welcome to my devlog on the creation of my solo project titled Haste. This was created using Unreal Engine 5.3.2, various Adobe software, and a lot of YouTube tutorials. Today I'm going to show you how the game went from this, to this, and finally this. I took it upon myself to create a 3D racing game, taking inspiration mainly from Forza, Mario Kart and Need for Speed. I decided to create this on my own as a challenge to not only improve my level design skills in a genre I haven't yet tackled, but also to improve my knowledge of blueprints and widgets in Unreal. I set out the following requirements. 1. The game must have a full game loop, including a win and lose condition. 2. The game must be mostly bug-free and functional. 3. All assets will be self-made excluding music. 4. The level design must have 3 iterations with games industry professionals giving feedback. 5. This all needs to be achieved within less than 4 months. I started planning out the scope of the project. I decided to make a few mood boards to get an idea of the base mechanics and potential blueprints I could make for the level. I also made a mood board for the visual theming of the level, which I decided would be a snow level, as this could allow me to play around with ice physics, which in a racetrack can make the level quite challenging, allowing for multiple iteration areas. I also used YouTube to browse for inspiration, such as a person who created a functioning racing game in just under 10 hours. This reassured me that the project was feasible in the time frame I was given. I created a node map based on the mood boards I made in the previous week. Stretch goals included randomized items, similar to games like Mario Kart, as well as speed boost panels, often featured in fast-paced racing games like F-Zero or Wipeout. However, these both require relatively advanced blueprinting knowledge and aren't as focused on the actual level design of the racetrack. I decided to give the level a lot of bends and corners, as a level that includes ice physics will require the player to drift along the ice and brake heavily to prevent them from flying off the track. I also gave it a ground floor and first floor, which may change as the map is developed, since this makes each part of the track more memorable, which is harder to achieve if the colours are all white and snowy in this map, as well as allowing for uphill and downhill physics in the map. I also added shortcuts that will need to be time tested in UE5, which allows for more replayability. Anything marked as a hazard will take advantage of the blue blockade game objects within the racing game template that have custom collision enabled on them, which will slow the player down when colliding with them. I also created a public GitHub repository with the UE5 project added into it, including a description. I then created the first draft of the level, which currently is simply a duplicate of the pre-existing default racing template, but with a start line and start text added to help separate the new map from the template. Steve Watts from GameSpot stated that the track design gets a lot of mileage out of moving parts like gears, and the whole thing is painted in gold and bronze tones to really sell the feeling that you're go-karting around an old grandfather clock when talking about the track Tick-Tock Clock from Mario Kart DS. This suggests that part of what makes a good racing level is the theme and how successfully it is communicated in gameplay. In this case, the level not only has the appearance of a grandfather clock through the skybox and background, but the obstacles are actual hands from a clock or numbers that you have to drift around. If I were to apply this to my snow level, I could have a giant snowball barreling down the hill section that the player must dodge, or having the sky be completely white with snow falling down to partially obstruct the player's vision, similar to real-life ski resorts. I created some more blueprints using a mixture of tutorials from YouTube combined with messing around with the sports car and vehicle advanced porn blueprints. One issue I encountered was editing the traction, slip and suspension of the player vehicle, as the template doesn't tell you this information and I couldn't find any information online, so I just opened the blueprint and changed some statistics until the car felt slippery to control for an ice level. I also reduced the strength of the brakes so it takes longer to slow the car to a complete stop. I also edited the AI slightly to have a slightly higher max speed as well as following the spline more tightly. I then added a lap counter with some extra code that starts you on lap 1 and ignores the first trigger point to allow you to pass the start line without immediately going to lap 2. I then disabled the player input after the lap counter reaches 4, marking the end of the race. I also added a ramp to prevent players from reversing across the start line to cheat the lap system. I then added an audio engine blueprint that increases and decreases the pitch of a looping car engine sound depending on your car's speed. The audio is royalty free and from Freesound. I plan to include any assets used in a credit screen. Finally, I started adding some snowy mountains, a tunnel at the start and some walls to prevent the vehicles from falling off the map on the top floor. I also added some BSPs to give the splines on the top floor an underside. I discovered that a lot of track layouts in a variety of racing games have some differences between the snow and ice levels and the regular levels such as plains and forests. The main difference is that the regular levels have a much simpler layout with mostly straight roads, whereas the snow levels tend to have a lot more bends, verticality and branching paths, as well as a wider track for more room for error since the controls on snow levels tend to give the vehicle less traction. I finally created a working game loop for my racing game. I achieved this by creating a pause menu with restart and quit buttons on a canvas. One canvas has "you win" text and is triggered when the lap number is greater than 3, and the other canvas has "you lose" text that appears when the timer is equal to 0. I added a timer as it can be changed later depending on playtests and how many people successfully complete the level. I also added a start menu with a credit screen for any royalty-free assets I use, as well as background racing music for the level that loops. I then changed the project settings in Unreal so that the project opens in the menu scene. I added a snowball that uses the collision physics from the cylinder walls with heavier mass and spawned inside an empty box trigger that has collision enabled. When the player drives through a separate trigger, the box is destroyed and the snowball barrels towards the player. My next steps include adding more than one snowball, as well as figuring out how to make the snowball reset itself, including the box collision flaps 2 and 3. Most of the blueprints were made using tutorials on YouTube, however some of them, such as the snowball, were made from playing around with nodes and testing. I also created a lot more static meshes such as chairs, windmills and hotels to give a better idea of the environment the player is in. I added a car park using the template's built-in vehicle meshes, as well as directional arrows informing the player of an incoming sharp bend in the track. I am aware that usually relying on arrows to inform the player on where to go in a level is usually bad level design. However, racing games like Forza and Gran Turismo are the exception, as road signs are needed to prevent crashes and keep the sport safe. Here we have the first iteration of the racing game snow level. New features include the following: a fully functioning game menu with buttons that allow you to quit and play the game, a credit screen for the audio used, controls for PS5 and PC, a new tutorial level which is based on the template track layout to teach the mechanics of the game, a working pause menu, snow level fully textured using MTUT standard materials for level design with measurements on each material, the slip on the ice physics material being greatly reduced and the braking controls of the vehicle being increased, as well as a Google Forms document which was created for feedback on iteration 1. Background assets have been converted to static meshes to save space, as well as animated windmills to further add character to the snowy mountain setting. I then increased the mass of the player vehicle to reduce turtling. I then changed the colour of the player from silver to green to better make them stand out and easier to identify between the players, enemies and objects. Finally, I converted the latest GitHub commission to an iteration 1 release, which allows the playtesters to easily find the correct version. The build is working and available to play on Windows. It took some testing to get the game working with a PS5 controller, since UE5 recognises the controller as having 96 different buttons, so I needed to change some project settings and add some plugins to make it compatible. Currently the UI does not work with the gamepad. Here is iteration 2. Iteration 2 includes the following changes: a new nitro boost system, a new drifting handbrake system, updated UI, new audio and sound effects, updated track layouts with smoother slopes and less steep inclines, added verticality around corners and alternative pathways, risk-reward routes with faster routes including ice physics, an updated menu, new animations, improved vehicle stability, increased sense of speed with field of view zoom and added lighting near the track, and more minor changes. The biggest addition to iteration 2 is the new nitro boost system. The purpose of this boost system is to add more speed to the game, inspired by the boost and drift system of Need for Speed, and to add a risk-reward element as you lose stability but gain infinite acceleration. Currently, thanks to some car controls adjustments, without the boost your car will never go faster than 80 miles per hour. Both the minimap and boost system were made with the help of YouTube blueprinting tutorials, but all of the blueprints had to be adjusted by myself since the tutorials used the old outdated sports car porn instead of the new vehicle adventure porn. The boost was first created as a Niagara particle system, which was coloured blue to fit with the theme of snow and cold colours, as well as to not distract the player's eyes too much from the road. I then added some emissives and glow to the initial lifespan, and then fade out to darker colours the longer the particle lives. One issue I encountered with this system was the tutorial spawned over 500 particles per second to make the system visually more appealing. However, thanks to the snow particles already in my level and all the collision objects, when I tested the game with this amount, the frame rate reduced to below 10 frames per second, so I had to drastically reduce the spawn rate and sacrifice some visual fidelity in order to make the game run at a stable frame rate, which is at least 30 frames per second. After creating the Niagara system, I added the blueprint nodes to make the function functionality. Now, when left shift is pressed or held, the max RPM is increased and the rotation is increased, completely bypassing stability controls. Bypassing these is what allows Nitro mode to accelerate indefinitely. I then added the UI in the bottom left and made it green, as Nitro, thanks to games like Crash Bandicoot, is often associated with green, as well as it standing out from the rest of the UI. The bar was then given a slant to add to the sense of speed. Finally, I added UI input and output nodes to make the bar increase and decrease based on the code. Before this, I had print strings showing the player how much Nitro fuel was remaining. However, due to time constraints, I won't be adding Nitro items that further help refill your boost gauge, so instead it will passively recharge after use. I will increase or decrease the recharge rate based on Iteration 2's feedback. Next up is the improved lighting system. After adding curved angled incline corners to sharp bends, I realised there was no warning on the road telling the player that a steep incline or tough bend was approaching. To fix this issue, I added street lights along the track. I then made some lights red, indicating danger and sharp corners, and encouraging players to slam the brakes, similar to red signs on the road in real life. Anything else was using a yellow soft light to make players aware that whilst those smoother parts of the track aren't as dangerous, they're still worth paying attention to. Placing street lights also helped add to the feeling of speed, since the objects were close to the car and there were a lot of them. The player would pass multiple lights in mere seconds, which adds to the sense of speed. I then created a custom skid mark effect using Niagara systems that is only activated when either pressing S or spacebar. Here is some footage of the skid mark system. Similarly to the Nitro effect, this particle only spawns on an input and is otherwise disabled. The spawn rate was also decreased to maintain a stable performance, and the texture for the skid mark was created using a custom brush tool in Photoshop. I then added a secondary skid grey smoke system that spawns a few seconds after the previous system has been alive for. However, the lifespan of this secondary smoke had to be greatly reduced to also maintain a stable frame per second. I created this to help encourage players to use the handbrake system for sharp turns, as well as to provide visual feedback to help keep players focused on the centre of the screen where the road is located. In the previous iteration, players had to solely rely on the speedometer in the corner to determine their speed, which often meant players were looking at the UI too frequently and therefore more likely to crash. The last two things I added this week were an improved audio system and a stronger main menu. Need for Speed Heat uses a lot of neon colours in the menu, so this served as my inspiration for redesigning the menu, as previously it was just a 2D smoke image with some button input. I took the Nitro Niagara system and placed that in the background to hint at one of the game mechanics, as well as keeping the menu map more active and engaging, and hinting at the snow theming of the main level. This is also why the menu buttons have blue and purple colours, as the blues and purples are associated with the cold. I then placed the player car in the centre of the screen, surrounded by neon lighting inside a white box to give an illusion of a large garage. I also plan to add camera changes when accessing the credits and controls menu, depending on the scope and remaining time after finishing Iteration 3. The menu music is using the stock music provided by Unreal Engine 5, as the song already fits the modernised garage aesthetic. I also ensured the credit screen included any assets downloaded and used in the project, such as the royalty-free music, although my goal with this project was to create as many assets on my own as possible. The improved audio system includes a collision sound effect that plays when colliding with any static mesh that has collision enabled and overlapping actors. This took some time, as every single object had to be individually selected and changed to have generate overlap events enabled to allow the audio collision blueprint to work. The only issue I encountered with this system is that it doesn't apply to BSPs, as they have no mesh options, so they will need to be converted to static meshes and replaced into the map to support audio collision. The sound effect is a generic explosion built into Unreal, although for a lot of the audio I needed to adjust the pitch, volume and looping to keep the audio balanced as to not scare the player with incredibly loud sound effects. A variety of other sound effects were added into Iteration 2, including the following: music for the menu and tutorial levels, button click sounds, hovered button sounds, nitro boost sounds, braking sounds, and a quit sound effect. In the final iteration, I may also add some voiceover for the tutorial as trigger boxes to make the game more accessible. In the next few weeks, whilst waiting on feedback for Iteration 2 from games industry veterans, I have created a second and third racetrack to make this project into a full indie racing game, and to add some polish and gain more track design knowledge in the meantime. These two tracks are a night forest track and an evening desert track. These will not be iterated on, as I don't have time for iterating them. However, they are built based on the feedback from previous iterations of the snow level. Here are some key details about the desert and forest levels. Firstly, both levels have smooth long straights and less sharp corners to make the game more similar to racing simulators like Forza and Need for Speed, instead of party races like Mario Kart. Secondly, both levels make use of verticality changes and constant height changes. As mentioned earlier, one issue with the snow level's first iteration was that there were only two height levels, the ground floor and the first floor. This made the level quite basic and boring, so in the forest and desert levels I ensured that if you weren't on the ground, you would often be moving upwards or downwards. I also took the street lighting and colour coding and transferred it to these levels too. Each level also involves the excitement and danger seen in Need for Speed. This can be seen in the forest level with the ramp launch and the desert level with the long downward straight. The downward straight is the fastest part of any of the races, and if you don't learn how to steer correctly, you can crash relatively easily. The ramp in the forest is indicated by the red lights seen here and requires use of the nitro boost to successfully cross the gap, saving you some precious seconds of lap time. If you fail, you can still get back on track by following the yellow leading lights. To add some variety in world building, each race takes place at a different time of day. The snow level takes place in the daytime, then the forest is at night, and then the desert takes place in the evening. I made sure the desert was an evening level, since evening colours are oranges and yellows which complement the desert dunes. I achieved this appearance by rotating the position of the directional lights, lowering the intensity and adding a blue and orange hue to each level. To achieve the textured sands as seen in this image, I made use of the erosion tool in the landscaping settings. I then added it to the front and back side of the dunes to create some depth and lining across the top of the dunes with some use of the smoothing tool so that the sand didn't appear overly rough. The cacti were created as static meshes which were then converted into a foliage tool, although I did have an issue with the foliage spawning the cacti either too high above ground or buried below the ground. I then solved this by adjusting the height spawn settings in the mesh. You may also notice that the desert is a much larger track and appears to be significantly longer than the previous two levels. I did this intentionally, knowing that the desert race would be the final race in the Grand Prix before cutting to the win screen. This is a common tactic used in games, such as Mario Kart's famous track Rainbow Road. This track is often placed last in a Grand Prix due to being difficult with sharp corners and no walls at all. The difficulty of the sand level is also why the width of the splines used to create the roads have been reduced. The snow level has the widest track, followed by the forest, then finally the desert. I may need to adjust the timer blueprint however, as currently all three levels have a limit of 6 minutes 30 seconds. This is appropriate for the first level, however the other two require more playtesting, especially since I'm not sure you can even finish the desert race in under 660 seconds. The final thing I added was blueprint and widget changes. I added a next level button and modified the duplicated windscreen widgets so that race 2 would load after winning race 1 and race 3 loading after winning race 2. I then added a very basic win state congratulating the player that boots them back to the menu. I also had an issue with the player camera, as when going downhill, a lot of players cannot see what's ahead of them, or they could even see through the floor. To fix this, I created a view change using camera position nodes, so that when you press and hold the left mouse button, the camera pulls away to allow the player to better see what's ahead of them, and more importantly, not clip through the floor. I added invisible box collisions around the desert level to prevent players falling off of the map. I tried increasing the height of the BSP walls, however this not only made the track visually unappealing as you couldn't see the desert itself, but it also still led to cars falling off the track. Here is the final iteration of my racing game snow level, inspired by Need for Speed. New changes and features include the following, based on feedback from iteration 2. 2 new racetracks with a win condition with the race level designs based on feedback from iteration 2, new music and sound effects with a dynamic location-based crowd audio system, voiceover and added text to the tutorial with an updated layout to teach the player about streetlights and nitro, a new camera zoom out angle useful for downhill slopes using the left mouse button to use it, a variety of new static meshes added to the snow level including foliage from UE5's built-in starter content, improved materials using the MTUT materials for level design and accurate scale measurements, an updated minimap, animated race intros, improved lighting with each level taking place at a different time of day, fake adverts, new garage car customization systems allowing the player to save their changes and have custom paint jobs, improved car controls with greatly reduced oversteer and a slight increase to mass, making it much more stable based on feedback from previous iterations, various bug fixes such as a GPU crash relating to a blocking volume and a local height fog, animated UI, additional ramps and shortcuts to the snow level, additional straights, various other minor changes and improvements, and an added master volume slider in the credit screen. The crash I encountered was a GPU and CPU issue, which was only occurring in the desert level. I realised that to fix the issue, some of the ambient local fog had to be removed to prevent any crashes. Due to many people being busy in December and January, I wasn't able to get as much feedback as the first iteration. However, one of the participants had played both iterations, so I was able to see that overall iteration 2 was an improvement over iteration 1. I noted that generally people found the game more fun as nobody rated it below a 3 out of 5. The first key change was the car controls. Whilst the handbrake mechanic made tight corners a lot easier and more fair, people still said that the car was a bit too light still and that the oversteer was still possible. I then increased the mass of the car from 1,800 to roughly 2,000 and increased the stability settings settings in the vehicle movement component to make it nearly impossible to oversteer. The nitro system and the time limit were both well received and overwhelmingly positive, as everyone was able to use the nitro boost and understand that you were sacrificing stability for speed. Additionally, people were able to beat the snow level within a time limit, and they all said the time limit was fair. Because of this, I didn't really change the time limit or the nitro recharge and drain speeds. Everyone played the tutorial, which is a good sign that players were effectively taught how to play the game, understood the objective, and how to use the new features like the nitro boost. Despite this, I still updated the tutorial with voiceover.
Welcome to your driving lesson. To get started, use WAS to steer and accelerate and D to brake.
To make it more accessible to visually impaired players, as well as to make the game feel closer to fast and cool car games with a lower pitch voice inspired by voiceover segments in Top Gear and the Grand Tour. I also added tutorial segments for the coloured lighting, as well as handbrakes and a longer straight between the initial start line and the nitro boost tutorial, since someone suggested in the tutorial to have a longer straight to give the player more time to adjust to the controls. Someone said the UI was overlapping, which I didn't realise was an issue, as I was primarily working on my university monitors, which use an ultra-wide screen. Since coming home for the Christmas break, I've been using a standard 16:9 monitor and realised the controls text and the lap UI were overlapping, so I then moved the laps more to the right to stop this issue. The car flipping over seemingly nothing or no obstacles was an issue I struggled to fix, as it seems to be related to the vehicle movement component code inside of Visual Studio. All I noticed was it happens sometimes as a side effect of braking from a very high speed of over 80 miles an hour. To help mitigate this issue, I decreased the strength and grip of the braking, so now it takes the player longer to reach a full stop from high speed. This reduced the jolting and makes the bug less likely to happen. Furthermore, I added more invisible blocking volumes all around all three racetracks to prevent players from clipping through the map. There was a fairly large visual overhaul between iterations 2 and 3. Some feedback suggested that the snow race still felt a little empty and lacking certain objects. People understood that it was a built racetrack with elements of realism thanks to the street lights inspired by Forza, however this wasn't enough. People suggested adding some Christmas decorations, since the snow could be associated with Christmas, as well as additional trees, rocks and foliage. Here you can see the additional static meshes I added, as well as some fake advert billboards, as many racing games include adverts along the wall sides of the tracks. The fake adverts also add to the world building, as the zoo and games console adverts imply the game is set in the modern day with a human audience. This also gave me the opportunity to learn on how to use the foliage system in UE5 under the landscaping window. I already practiced this with the cacti in the desert level, but learning how to increase and decrease the density and size of the foliage was essential. This was because, unlike the desert and forest levels, the snow level had multiple Niagara snow systems and an additional static mesh in the level, so adding too much foliage could have easily ruined the game's performance. Luckily, this was not an issue, as I made the static meshes relatively low poly and low in density. I also felt that the highest vertical point in the level, the wide area where the snowball used to be in iteration 1, still felt like it was lacking some personality and didn't have a distinct sub-theme now that the tree obstacles had been removed. To counter this, I added in some rock static meshes along the high mountains, as well as a connecting rock that the player can pass under between two snowy peaks. This added to the overall level and helped break it up better between the ground floor with flat snow and the mountainous peaks. The bushes in the final iteration were added using the engine starter content available in UE5, although I had to modify the bush and duplicate it with a different material, the strong white primary colour and some green highlights to make the bushes look like snow had fallen on them and they were covered in frost. Finally, to further immerse the player with a sense of speed and make the world feel more active, dynamic and alive, I added location-based 3D sound effects near the audience static meshes. This used a royalty-free looping crowd cheer sound effect. I then adjusted the fall-off distance of each 3D sound and the maximum volume until it felt natural. I wanted to use dynamic 3D sounds, as all previous sounds were 2D, and a crowd cheering in a race wouldn't be heard all the time. In any race in the real world, the racer would only hear the crowd's roars of excitement when whizzing past them, and they would be loud when only meters away. Here are the static meshes that have been added, adverts created in Adobe Photoshop, and the dynamic sounds. Creating the ads was tricky for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I had to change the font to be wide and thick since the player was going to be reading the adverts from a side angle, so the text needed to be wide enough to look normal from a side perspective. Secondly, I encountered a tiling issue where every time I placed the texture on a BSP, it would repeatedly tile in a very small size, something not seen on large advert posters in the motorway. I fixed this by replacing the BSP with a plain static mesh and increasing the exported texture size. Unfortunately, due to a mixture of overscope and a lack of useful tutorials available online, most Blueprint tutorials are using the outdated vehicle template and cannot be easily translated without extra manpower or months of work. The leaderboard system, the Ghost AI time trial car system, and the now bugged PS5 control support were unable to be added in a fixed state and have therefore been removed. After doing all this, I still felt like somehow there wasn't enough in the game to make it feel complete, despite putting in hundreds of hours on this project. I then remembered that when playing Need for Speed Heat, at the start of the game, when you choose your car, you are in a garage and can customize your car's paint job. I decided this would be one of the biggest new features added to Iteration 3. The final change I made was the addition of animated race intros to each stage. These were created using level sequences and cinematic camera actors, as well as some text showing off each level. One issue I encountered with the animated intros was the 3, 2, 1 go input delay. To fix this, I knew the animations were each 5 seconds long, so I added a 5-second delay to the 3, 2, 1 go animation blueprint and disabled input for the first 8 seconds. I hope you enjoyed this rather lengthy devlog. The project took a lot more time than planned. Thanks for watching.
Welcome to your driving lesson. To get started, use WAS to steer and accelerate and D to brake. You can also boost with left shift, trading stability with speed. Press and hold spacebar to slow down. Brake. Signs like these indicate a sharp corner. Yellow lights are normal, however red lights mean a slope or ramp. If your car is stuck or turtled, press R to reset its position. Who spilled dry ice? Be careful, racer, some surfaces may affect your car's traction. Some objects have physics which may block your path. You may need to deal with hills too. Slow down when going downhill. Press and hold the left mouse button to change. Look out for shortcuts. They do require more experience though. That's it. Now finish 3 laps before the timer runs out to win. Good luck. 2 laps left. Final lap. Two laps left. final lap. Two laps left. fine